Hi, welcome to this part of my review featuring the Midnight Legacy of Darkness setting for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you haven't seen the other parts of my review, featuring this world where evil rules supreme and being good is considered a sin, please check out the playlist in the description below. This time we are going to take a look at the dawn of the First Age. More than 8,000 years ago, an elven sorcerer named Aradil ascended to the throne of the High Kings and Queens of Erethdor. Aradil won the crown and the loyalty of her people through her own noble lineage and great wisdom. Her adoring subjects dubbed her the Witch Queen as a mark of respect for her unmatched ability as a sorcerer. Scholars would later refer to Aradil's coronation as the advent of the First Age. Her rule ushered in a golden era for the elven people that became one of the highest points in the cultural history of Aerith. The prosperity of the elves eventually spread to the other peoples of the continent, spurring economic, political, and cultural advances across Eredain. Such a flourishing had not occurred since before the Sundering, and may never occur again. Knowledge of the natural world, science, and magic reached such levels that it seemed elven powers might have no bounds. They used their magic to tame all of Erethdor to their will. Within Erethdor, the great tree city of Caradul, the seat of Aradil's rule, came into its own. The elves also founded many outpost towns like Althorin and Isen, beyond Erethdor's fringes on the western shores of the Ivan Sea and along the Thalthera River. The Elven court established embassies and missions in the great dwarven cities and among the gnomes and halflings as well. Cultural exchange and respect became proud traditions. The dwarven clanholds of the Caladrons also experienced a time of great peace and achievement. Though skirmishes with the northern orcs continued, the dwarves' own often contentious relations were peaceful, and they welcomed trade and cultural exchange with other peoples. On the open plains of central Eredain, halfling culture changed too. Many tribes gave up their nomadic ways and settled into earthen villages, becoming able farmers. Through trade and cultural exchange with the elves, the halflings discovered an innate ability with the arcane and became proficient users of simple magic. As trade and travel between the younger Fae increased, many of the gnome fisherfolk turned their small boats into coastal traders. The prosperity that followed meant more boats and expanded trade routes. Whole families began to abandon life ashore as the gnomes discovered a penchant for barter and commerce. However, orc raiders continued to harass frontier settlements and were a constant threat to trade caravans and other travelers. Both the dwarves and the elves were forced to establish patrols in the northern regions of the realms to keep Isrador's bloodthirsty minions at bay. In the winter of 3893, an old seer named Resial came to the High Court of the Witch Queen, bearing word that he promised was of dire importance, and Aradil agreed to a private audience. Though it is not known what passed between them, or what proof he offered for his claims, the queen emerged from the meeting in a thunderous fury. She ordered the old man, a monk from a long-forgotten religious order, to send for his fellow monks, whom she then installed as secret advisors to the throne. Though the group called itself the Order of Truth, beyond the walls of the Elven court, these prophets of the lost gods became known as the Abandoned. The monks came to the city and shared with Aradil an ancient prophecy passed down from a time before the rise of the younger Fae. According to the portent, a great darkness would rise and fall across the land. It would bring with it a demon horde bent on destruction and firestorm of divine magic that would lay waste to Eredain. For over 1,000 years, the Witch Queen would watch the north with wary concern. Her grim moods, strange orders, and increasingly frequent absences troubled the court. In the end, her secret obsession and magical preparations would prove a salvation to all the people of Eredain, though sadly, only a temporary one. If doom and war was on the northern horizon, only the Witch Queen saw it. Had she been looking to the south as well, she might have played a hand in keeping it from coming ashore there instead. In the spring of 3951, the Dornes landed their small ships in southern Eredain. The Dornes were a barbarous, seafaring race of humans, great lumbering beings with pale skin, almost as much hair as dwarves, and even less refinement. They first settled along the southern coast, but soon began sailing their long boats far up the Erin River. When they encountered the halfling tribes and gnome barge families, they slaughtered the strongest adults and took many of the meeker ones and children as thralls. They burned villages and rafts and grabbed everything of value. The first Dornish raids against elven and dwarven outposts were devastating. The Dornes were hardened warriors before they came to Eredain, and the dwarves and elves had never fought against anything but disorganized and undisciplined marauders or wandering monsters. The Dornes were neither disorganized nor undisciplined, and their individual bravery made them savage opponents. The dwarves, elves, gnomes, and halflings raised armies. Their common folk and leaders became soldiers and learned the arts of war. They and the Dornes built fortresses, and foundries pounded out weapons. War raged across the plains of Eredain, as thousands of years of peace were forgotten. 100 years, then 2, then 3. For more than 300 years, the people of Eredain fought over lands that had once been at peace. Word of a new threat first reached the Elven court in 4393, in the last years of the Dornish War. Initially, the stories of battlefield dead rising to fight again were passed off as delusions suffered in the heat of battle. Later, as official reports claimed that the dead soldiers were returning to their encampments and attacking the living, the Order of Truth saw it as a new portent of the Shadow's growing influence and warned Aradil. They did not understand exactly why this foul thing was happening, but they were certain it was a legacy of the death and destruction of the Long War. This new horror became a bane across Eredain, as the Fae and the Dornes alike were forced to fend off these terrifying creatures. In addition to fighting the war, soldiers had to patrol against roving bands of undead, spreading their resources even thinner and suffering even more casualties. Aradil and her monk advisors feared it was the influence of Isrador that had maintained the violence of the Dornish War for so long. They could sense it in the flow of magic, and somehow knew that the continued war only served to feed the growing shadow in the north. Many believed it was the threat of superior elven magics and dwarven fortitude that made the peace last. Though many hundreds of years would pass before the younger Fae would learn to trust the Dornish invaders, the peoples of Eredain settled into a long period of peace and relative prosperity. By the year 4560 of the First Age, the entire shoreline of the Iban Sea had been settled by the 12 great houses of the Dornish monarchs and carved up into small kingdoms, baronies, and manorial estates. Most became rich by dominating trade and transport over the Iban Sea, which they now called the Sea of Peluria, in honor of their lost homeland. Despite this welcome age of peace across Eredain, the Order of Truth was fearful and continued preaching wariness. The Order's monks warned that the power of the Shadow in the north was waxing. As Aradil listened to the voices of these monks, the abandoned, a small band of monks in the ancient monastic village of Vandilrin were lured by a different voice, an insidious shadow of a voice that promised dark salvation and the return of a god's favor. In the year 4705, of the First Age, the monastery of Vandilrin was a remote outpost, a quiet place of learning and meditation. One of its younger members, now remembered only as Vairial the Betrayer, began hearing a quiet voice during his meditations. Thinking that the spirits of the lost gods might be returning to Eredain, he opened himself to the voice and was consumed. Though still weak, Isrador had garnered enough strength to reach out from the cold north and trap a pliant soul. Over the next centuries, the Order worked to corrupt as many beings of Eredain as they could, infiltrating religious and secular organizations alike to achieve their aims. Their leadership, called legates, had sacrificed their souls to the growing will of Isrador. In the spring of 5133, the long peace was shattered as a vast army poured out of the north. The long quiet along the frontier had only been a time of preparation, as Isrador had built up, trained and armed his invasion force. The Witch Queen had not been idle, however. Her long obsession with the shadow had been filled with secret preparations. She had trained many powerful battle mages and armed legions of archers with magical arrows. She had parleyed with the dire animals of Erethor and recruited them to her army. She also sent emissaries, agents, to contact the Dornish monarchs and the other members of the Younger Fae. In the first months of the invasion, Isrador's army flooded out of the mountains and poured across the plains. The orcs that made up the core of his army were no disorganized raiders. For the first time, they marched under the banners of their legions, and goblins, trolls, and giants charged forth at their side. Foul demons bound to Isrador's will flew overhead or prowled on the edges of the army. Dreadful magics preceded the host, the divine might of the fallen god. Frozen winds and rains of lightning helped to clear their way. Wicked clerics and traitors from the Dornish lands, many wielding divine powers not seen since the time of the Elder Fae, led the invaders and burned the path towards Erethor. As it marched south, Isrador's army sacked Nalford, Kael, and Haldred, killing everyone who did not flee before it. Knowing that Aradil's greatest power lay within Erethor, Isrador's army skirted the forest, intending to enter it at Althorin, and then force their way southwest to Caradul. Aradil and her generals did not give them the chance, and in a surprise strategy, marched their defenders to meet the Shadow's hordes on the plains of Eris Aman. The tales passed down of the Battle of Three Kingdoms, which were the Elves of Erethor, the Caladron Dwarves, and the Dornes, seem like nothing less than myths and legends. In truth, they are not fantastic enough. Divine and arcane magics clashed and rent the sky. Black clouds born on the foul north wind covered the battlefield with poison and ice. Flights of sorcerous arrows flew in volleys so thick they blocked out the sky. Orc blood formed a great dark swamp that mixed with the rivers of red flowing from slaughtered defenders. Dire wolves ripped out the throats of ogres, and giants broke the backs of massive bears. Demons raged across the field, attacking anything, mindless with bloodlust. The Shadow's legates cast their spells and hunted the Witch Queen. Aradil's sorcerous host loosed terrible fires as she stalked Isrador's generals. The battle was a lurid nightmare of clashing blades, dying screams, and freezing gore. The Battle of Three Kingdoms lasted 6 days. More than 5,000 soldiers of the Three Kingdoms died. 40,000 of Isrador's foul minions were slain. The Shadow forces broke and fled. The Three Kingdoms were victorious. The surviving Three Kingdoms forces spent months hunting down fleeing bands of Isrador's soldiers, killing as many as they could find. They were also forced to destroy the countless fel that had risen from the bloodiest battlefield in Eredain's history. These skirmishes and battles took their own toll, and many more brave warriors were killed. By winter of the next year, what remained of Isrador's forces had been driven back into the northern wastes. Most of the undead had been destroyed, and the hard-won peace had returned to the lands. Aradil and her host returned to Erethor, not daring to hope that the shadow in the north had been defeated for good. In her heart, the Witch Queen knew this battle had not been the end. She knew Isrador would return. And this concludes this part of the review. In the next part, we are going to talk about the dawn of the Second Age. I think there are valuable lessons when it comes to the history of Eredane in this midnight setting. You really need to put your differences aside to challenge a greater or more insidious power. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to ally yourself with traitors and weaklings. As you can see, this order of monks were corrupted and they now serve Isrador. But sometimes initial conflicts served more as an introduction between different peoples. They were ugly, they were savage, but after the differences were smoothed out, these free peoples banded together to fight against the greater threat of Isrador, and they were successful. For now. For how long? Thank you for watching this part of the review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending right through RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.